Matthew Lamb, a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, is currently professor and chair of theology at Ave Maria University in Naples, Florida, where he is helping to direct the newly established graduate program in theology. After his own graduate studies in Rome and Munster, he has taught at Marquette University and subsequently at Boston College, during which time he was also a visiting professor at the University of Chicago at the Maryknoll School of Theology in New York. He's lectured widely and published broadly. His publications, which reflect his serious engagement with the tradition, include studies on such figures and topics as Thomas Aquinas, political theology, and the work of one of his teachers, Bernard Monaghan, whose Festschrift Father Lamb edited. Currently, he is completing a study on St. Augustine, Boethius, and St. Thomas, entitled Eternity, Time, and the Life of Wisdom. Personally, it is an honor for me and a joy to introduce Father Lamb, as I was a student of his in Boston over 15 years ago, when I was 10 and he was 20. And I've benefited much from his scholarship and teaching. Additionally, as a priest, and so as someone who is committed to the theological mission of the Church, and as a product of graduate theological education, most recently here, where I've been the beneficiary of other superb scholars and teachers, I'm most interested in hearing Father Lamb's reflections on joy in the truth, graduate theological education in the new millennium. Welcome, Father.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here at the Professor David Solomon's Institute. And I know this is you just had a marvelous lunch, and it is the siesta time. And my father used to always tell me, Matt, your writings make terrific siesta reading. So I thought rather than read to you, I put some things here on the board, although I know my 5th grade teacher, Sister Mary Magellan, always complained about my penmanship, and you can see why. I want to briefly sort of go over what are the challenges facing graduate theological education today at the dawn of the 3rd millennia. And I say on the introduction, first of all, there is the intellectual apostolate, that this is an apostolate. That is, living an intellectual life is not something that is cut off from a life of worship, of prayer, of science, of scholarship. All of this, there is an integration, and we've been blessed by having 2 popes. I don't think it's really occurred in recent history where we've had 2 popes, John Paul II and now Benedict XVI, both of whom had extensive experience in the university life and realized the importance of the university in contemporary cultures. And they did this because they had a sense of the challenges that are facing Catholics today through the development of, during the 2nd millennium, the development of science, technology, scholarship. And today is the feast of St. Teresa of Lisieux, whom John Paul II made a doctor of the Church. And he did so for a purpose, as he did most of his canonizations and so on. And we're going to see what it is that he's trying to bring about, that there is, in the 3rd millennium, we have a challenge. And the title I took from the title of the conference on Joy in the Truth, because there is something about Catholicism that we have to mediate and communicate to the wider academic and social and political culture. And I think Robert Hutchinson, the distinguished professor at the University of Chicago, wrote back in the 1930s, he said, the Catholic Church has the longest intellectual tradition of any institution in the contemporary world. The best service Catholic education can perform for the nation and all education is to show that the intellectual tradition can again be made the heart of higher education. What does he mean by that? That is linked to what John Paul II refers to an ex corde ecclesiae. What does it mean that the intellectual tradition can again be made the heart of higher education? Well, I think that there is a way that graduate theological education, it's a wonderful vocation, and it is frustrating, and it causes enormous suffering, like any great vocation. To be a graduate student of theology. Why is it? It is phenomenal because we are to foster. I mean, first of all, we have so much to learn. No one of us can possibly learn even all of it. If we learn only a little bit of it, we've got 2 millennia of traditions to learn, to assimilate. And so there has to be this integration is crucial, and collaboration. And this integration and collaboration is something we become part of a great procession. The procession of saints and scholars, theologians, down through the centuries, down through the millennia, who have engaged in this vocation of being and trying to be a theologian. And St. Athanasius was really a terrific member of the procession. And remember, processions, if you know Flannery O'Connor, she contrasts processions and marches. Marches are all lockstep, and everybody knows exactly where they are, and it's just boom, boom, boom. It's, human beings acting like a machine. Processions meander. And processions can go here and there and so on. And so this procession, it's a procession, being a theologian. And Athanasius writes, anyone who wishes to grasp and understand the work of theologians must first cleanse and wash their souls by their conduct and approach the saints in the imitation of their deeds, so that being included in their company through the manner of their lives, they may understand those realities which have been revealed to them by God, and thenceforth, as if joined to them, may escape the danger that threatens sinners and those who turn away from the wonderful wisdom and holiness revealed to us in Christ Jesus from the Father through the Holy Spirit. That's the way he concludes De Incarnatione. Now, what is it then that this integration of past and present moving into the future, we're faced today with historicism, nihilism, relativism, as you see from Fides et Ratio, and then most recently the address of Benedict XVI about the dictatorship of relativism. And there is, well, I'll say more about that in a bit. It's one of the downsides of the end of the second millennium, but there's many upsides too in the second millennium. And there is a way that, why theology within a university? It is central. As Father Lonergan mentions at the end of Insight, if the human sciences don't have theology, they don't have the ability to discern good from evil, as in fact it occurs in history. And then, without theology, the human sciences tend to surrender to a mentality, and this he was taking from Hobbes and Hume and Locke and Rousseau, to a kind of social engineering. This depersonalization of the human sciences is something we'll speak a little bit more about that. But first of all, just a very quick rundown of some of the key elements. These are things probably you've already had a great deal of talks on. As I say, this is the siesta period. So we know, first of all, the first millennial intellectual orientation. And I call that intellectual orientation a sapiential scientia, or sciential if you want to. I want to distinguish empirical science from the sciences as scientia as it was developed in the early Middle Ages at the beginning of the second millennium. But it is really the sapiential approach, You know how in terms of Plato and then Aristotle, in the classical understanding you had the dimensions of the soul, the appetites, the spiritedness or emotion and reason or intelligence, and these are the three types of souls, and they're all together in our human existence. The higher can take up the lower, so that with all plants we share the appetites, with the other animals, the spiritedness or emotions, and we are the rational animals. And they see that as three different ways of living that are still very operative today. You have, correlative to the appetites, the productive way of living. And in order to do that, you need the technique, the arts, the skills. For the practical political way of living, in terms of spiritedness, whenever any colleagues or friends of mine are very dispirited by whoever happens to win an election or what party is in the ascendancy, I say, just wait. Like one's emotions, it'll change. And what happens in the practical political, that there we have to cultivate the moral virtues. Now, there's difference between virtue and skill, and this was lost in the later half of the second millennium. The good, that when you want to know the good of the productive way of life, the good is in the product. So that when I was in the monastery, if Brother Joseph, I asked him to make me a table, and Brother Joseph brought me the table, and he said, while I was making this, I was wrapped up to the third heaven. I experienced this wonderful, overwhelming presence of God. And then I look at the table, and it's rattly. You know, he's a mystic, a saint, but he's not a good carpenter. In other words, the skills, you see, are, you can have people, sometimes at universities, I'm sure it's not the case here at Notre Dame. I know at Boston College was, one thinks, oh, these IT people, they're very skilled with computers, but they need more virtues. In other words, it's not that the good is in the thing produced, not in all that the producer needs is skill. And that's often linked with, as the ancients and medievals analyzed it, various ways of manipulating our bodily movements, the whole integration. For the practical political way of life, we need virtues. The good in virtuous living, whether it be moral or intellectual virtues, is in the one doing. It's the difference between doing, acting, praxis, and producing, making. The good is immanent within us. And so that's why, in terms of virtues, the moral virtues needed for the practical political way of life, and for the theoretic contemplative, the intellectual virtues. Now, moderns tend, and when I use moderns, I'm saying, Enlightenment down through postmodernism, we tend to look upon the theoretic contemplative way of life as, people in an ivory tower thinking great thoughts. No, it's knowing realities. God is not an abstraction. God is more really present here now than we are. We are present only because in, by, and from God. So that it's knowing realities, knowing our own minds as not intrinsically conditioned by space and time. And as we grow older, we see how it's, we're still the persons we are. And what that means. I mean, and there's a whole monastic tradition that was built up in terms of both the practical, political, and the theoretic. When Athanasius wrote the life of Anthony, it's often translated as the life of Holy Anthony or Saint Anthony. But the Greek title is the life kai politeia, and political regime, way of living, political, practical way of living of the Holy Anthony. They realized that there was this cultivation of the moral and the intellectual. Now, the key thing about this is, and this is the hardest thing, I mean, we moderns are all dualists. We're born into a culture, as de Tocqueville said about America, nowhere is Descartes so little studied, but his precepts and philosophy so rigorously applied as in America. So we have this sort of dualistic, we think, oh, here's body and here's mind, Descartes, the res cogitans, the res extensa, and we project that back gloriously into the patristic and medieval periods, and thinking, there they are. They're all those dualists, and they hated the body, and we loved the body, and all that. And part of Pope John Paul II, his theology of the body was precisely to help us recover this unity, identity, whole. We're ensouled bodies. We don't have these two different natures at war in us. But what we do have, there is a dualism of ways of living. The ordered, as I say under here, the ascensional mode of living, that is, how do our appetites and our emotions flourish? When we have the virtue, the excellence, to guide them by our intelligence. So, it's not that the couch potato who keeps eating all of those potato chips and then all of those Twinkies and Ho-Hos and everything else, that's not helping his appetites, his senses, his other things. It's not healthy. And so there is that sense of the appetites, our emotions, in this ascensional mode, living by what is highest in us, was the way that you had Plato and Aristotle talking about the proper virtuous way of living. But there is also a descensional, disordered way, when we use our reason to try and manipulate our either our emotions or our appetites. And of course, the fathers, the Greek and Latin fathers, as well as the monastic authors, saw this in St. Paul's dualism of the way of living. We live either according to the Spirit or according to the flesh. And of course, what they did, the fathers, the Greek and Latin fathers, they saw that indeed this living by what is highest, not just in us, but what is highest in itself, the Holy Spirit. This whole revelation of Jesus Christ, this is how we can live. So there is that, and Augustine, see, in the, both the Greek and Latin fathers have this, but Augustine articulates in the Confessions the threefold conversion process. In books 5 through 7, he's really zeroing in on the intellectual conversion. That is, he couldn't bring himself to understand a spiritual reality. He thought God and everything else had to have some extension and duration. So that wonderful passage where he says, yes, God, I imagined you to be this infinite sea with no boundary, and the universe like a big sponge within this sea. It could be as big as you want it. And that was, that somehow or other, this way of imagining, it was kind of what he calls picture thinking. And what Augustine is doing there, at the chapter 1 of book 7, he's not talking about some kind of Platonic theory. He's trying to get the reader, each of us, doesn't matter what age we're in, to realize, he says, I did not realize that the act by which I form images is not itself an image. Or just our conscious self-presence, what's most intimate to each and every one of us. That is, for him, he says, he uses, as Gadamer says of all the ancients and medievals, the metaphor of light, this conscious self-presence that we all experience. We don't have to go to school to get it. We don't buy it at Walmart. It's us. It's most intimately us. That this conscious self-presence, it can form images. I mean, now, there's Father Lamb going on and on and on. You can have images of, being in Hawaii or wherever and your imagination. But we don't have to form images. Walker Percy uses that wonderful example in The Moviegoer where he, the fellow who had the identity crisis, and he'd pull out his wallet and look at his picture on his driver's license. That's me. We don't have to do that. That's where Augustine is getting at this intellectual conversion, that our souls are made in the image and likeness of God. We experience this this self-presence, and this self-presence doesn't create. We didn't create it. We don't instruct it. It's a gift. It is the image of God in us. And that's why he goes on to talk then about the moral conversion. And again, the moral conversion, Pace, dear Father McBrien, who in one of his columns, was inveighing against Augustine for being not liking the body and so on. He says, the body isn't the problem in Book 8 of the Confessions. It's his mind. He says, the mind gives the body an order. Move your hand, and it moves it right. The mind gives itself an order. Stop smoking. It's not good for you. Or stop, fooling around. As he was trying, he recognized himself in terms of his sexual promiscuity, and it's not obeyed. What is this monstrosity? So he sees the moral conversion, and then at the end of Book 8, he can only be morally converted in Christ Jesus. But he recognizes in picking up Romans 13:13 that Jesus Christ is not an abstraction, not someone who only lived back in Palestine at a certain time, or Israel, but rather that he is the Lord of history, yet he is present now, and as the Word incarnate. Now this threefold conversion, intellectual, moral, and religious, Aquinas takes over at the beginning of the second millennium, and through his use of metaphysics, of course, it's the intellectual, moral, and theological virtues. So that moves on, and what it's meant is precisely to promote an ordered, ascensional, integrating way of living. And the key problem that the ancients had was evil. And first of all, why is it so hard for us to live by what is highest in us? Why, I'm sure you've all had, I have it all the time. Why did I do that stupid thing? Why is it so hard for us to live by what is highest in us? And so few people, as Plato and Aristotle, Plotinus and the others saw, so few people attain it. Evil, injustice. And Augustine saw, as well as Gregory of Nyssa and the Cappadocians, that the Socratic agnosticism, dear Socrates, whom, as Augustine says in The City of God, it were far better had the Romans built temples in honor of Socrates and Plato and the great philosophers than these gods and goddesses who were the projection of their own disordered desires. But at the end of the apology, I go to death, you stay in life. Who goes to the better part is known only to God. That kind of agnosticism in the face of death was unequal to the task of evil. And the ancients didn't know how to attribute evil. And they tend to say, well, there's a way that we're in matter. And so they tended to see matter. And Augustine, of course, in his Manichaean period, was going through exploring that. And he couldn't possibly see that. And that's why his favorite book in many respects was Genesis, the revelation that the whole of creation is good, and that evil and sin comes from a turning away from God, a turning away from his loving presence, and that it's not a part of our nature. Our nature is darkened but not destroyed and not rendered evil. It's fallen. But it's not a question of our nature or matter. It's a question of our history and our failure to respond to God's loving invitation. So evil and injustice comes in. And there's also just a couple things. One, the Catholic Aufhebung. That's what the German sublation. And this is important for historicism and nihilism. The higher, within Catholicism, genuinely higher developments, this is important in graduate studies of theology especially, higher integrations, genuine higher integrations, never negate the lower. They preserve and elevate the lower. So, whether you look in terms of the appetite, spiritedness, or reason, or you take the three dimensions of love, eros, erotic love, philia, love of friendship, agape, the love revealed in Christ Jesus, love even of one's enemies, the higher never negates the lower. This is where Hegel was in making negation an intrinsic element of sublation or of Hegel was wrong. And also, the genuine later developments in Catholic theology, they always preserve and elevate what went before. They never negate it. See, this negation, and if you want to see the dangers of negation and nihilism, read Edith Wissegrod's book, Spirit and Ashes. Hegel, Heidegger, and Man-Made Mass Death. This is why the horror of the Shoah and what it revealed to the end of the 20th century. And that's also then we see how this, in terms of, the ancients, they saw life and then the good life, and Socrates was willing to die rather than deny the virtues. The good life was more important than life itself. But then, if that is the case, what does it say about our history? If we have this agnosticism, and that's why the Greek and Latin fathers, why the intellectuals in the first millennia, they were so fascinated and attracted to the gospel, because Jesus is going around preaching eternal life, that the good life is taken up into eternal life. And not one instant of our lives is ever obliterated. It is present in the eternal, loving, infinite God who has loved us into being. So that kind of, again, this sublation, life is taken up into the good life, is taken up into eternal life. And all of the suffering and evil, we'll see in a bit. I just want to, oh my gosh, it's already 3 o'clock. Then, so the final thing is that what you see, this first millennial orientation is sapiential and sciential, is that you have this unity of wisdom and holiness. I mean, the kind of holiness that Athanasius is referring to, why John Paul II would make Therese, whose whole thing was love. Love is at the very heart of the universe and the heart of the church and the heart of all the apostolates. She's also the patron of missionaries, although she never left her convent. Because holiness and wisdom, that this sense of the whole, and what this wisdom means, I mean, it's both, as I say, revealed and a gift, the gift of wisdom, but it's also acquired. And this is for grad students in theology, why it's so important to have, a philosophy, a love of wisdom, real philosophy, as a love of wisdom, attuning our minds and our whole beings towards the whole. It's always heuristic. It's not that we know everything about the whole, but we know that everything within history, within nature, is related to everything else. And metaphysics is really developing these heuristic ways of integrating all the parts, all the partial, all the individual things. I mean, I think of, for instance, our experience of ourselves. We moderns, or those of us who are old enough to be moderns, a lot of you are younger, you're postmoderns, I guess. Although sometimes I think postmodernism is really just a kind of ultra-Nietzschean modernism, but that's a whole other argument. There is this aspect of, where because of Descartes, we tend to think of our bodies as what separate us from one another. And we have, Leibniz, the monadic me. I mean, we're cut off from everyone else. And you can't have two bodies in the same place at the same time. And so that's obviously what separates us from one another. And there's all kinds of philosophical and cultural, historical analyses of this. And yet it's utterly undermined now by two things, by genetics. I mean, each one of us here have literally thousands and thousands of genetic traces of concrete men and women, just like you and me, without whom we wouldn't genetically be who we are. And then, of course, there's this big thing, which was very obvious in Boston, when you've got over 200,000, as Michael will know, university, college students living within a 15 to 20 square mile area. the issue of sexually transmitted diseases is a major question. I mean, one very cynical administrator at a university, not Boston College, happened to mention in a discussion on this issue, he said, well, sometimes I'm rather grateful that HIV has such a long latency period. Otherwise, I'm afraid would be sued by the parents of some of the children. But notice what's happened now, and you've seen it probably in your own counseling and so on, where it's not that when you're sexually intimate with someone else, you're also being intimate with all the people that he or she has been intimate with. And this sense of, in other words, we're parts of that. Our sexuality, the intelligibility of our sexuality, is something that links us to the whole. And this was, there's many things to talk about in terms of Humanae Vitae. This, in my generation, this was the big, that was the blow up, you see, over. But what was the key thing that Paul VI was doing, was trying to give this sapiential realization of what the inner intelligibility of human sexuality is. And it was something that was learned in this first millennium, as Augustine points out. I had to give a talk at a conference on the crisis in the American family, and they wanted me to tell about the Catholic experience. So I said, well, boy, it goes back 2 millennia. And Augustine says, what caused the breakdown of the Roman Empire? What was the root cause? It was the loss of republican virtue, the virtues of the family. You know, if any of you saw, The Gladiator, you could see this kind of, the virtues of the family. They learned from the Germanic and Gaelic Irish tribes polygamy. And they didn't think that was a bad idea, so they started fostering polygamy. Well, what happens? As the historians of the family point out, boys didn't know who their fathers were. They started forming gangs. They weren't learning the disciplines that you need for a big city, a big empire, all the skills that have to be acquired, as well as some of the virtues. Because if you're, a cousin of mine was a car dealer, and he said, never buy a car that's made on Friday or Monday, especially Monday. I said, why is that? Well, they come in, they come in drunk from the weekend, and so their skills are not what they should be. But that, you need that kind of thing, and they weren't getting disciplined by their fathers. And as one historian of the family, not a Catholic, said, the Catholic Church for 3 centuries kept preaching, no matter how rich or how poor, one husband, one wife for life, for the procreation and education of the children. And I told them in Washington, I said, the cab driver who took me from the airport, he ran through a red light. I said, why did you do that? He said, a week ago somebody was shot here. I'm not going to. The gangs in the inner city, the breakdown of the family, and you're not going to solve this by redefining the family. It's something of our nature. So anyway, that kind of thing then in terms of the acquired wisdom and the prudential, the practical wisdom is so crucial. And that was one of the things, and of course now in Europe, I know some of my colleagues, I started my doctoral studies in 1968 in Germany, and there were colleagues and professors of mine or fellow students who were very opposed to Humanae Vitae. I had a chance to meet several of them a year ago when I was over in Germany, 2 years ago now. As you get older, the time flies by quickly. 2 years ago, and I talked to some of them. I said, did you realize what was going to happen? Now one of the jokes going around Europe? Black humor. One of the jokes is 50 years from now, the last Europeans will be shuffling along the Champs-Élysées with their walkers. And from the Eiffel Tower, the loudspeakers will blare out the Muslim call to prayer 5 times a day. And they'll pass this big monument, and down below it'll say, if only we had listened. And you look up, and it's a statue of Paul VI. This is depopulation is the major, and nobody wants to really, none of the statesmen or political parties, except unfortunately, and really unfortunately, the far right, want to really address this. Dutch friends and colleagues tell me in 5 years, the 4 largest cities in Holland will have majority Muslim populations. This is a major thing, and I remember talking to these people who were so adamant against Humanae Vitae, and one of them said, "Man, I was wrong. I couldn't see it coming. I didn't know. I wasn't aware of that." So anyway, this is this part of what we're facing then in terms of the second millennial orientation. It was phenomenal. I mean, they did. The family stabilized. So many of the European cities were built up around monasteries. Because how was this being carried forward, the sapiential scientia? You had the cathedral, monastic, convent, catechetical schools that were formed throughout Europe and throughout the East. And these were to cultivate intellectual and moral a community of friends who are worshiping the holy, good God. So holiness and acknowledging the wisdom and trying to acquire the wisdom. That it's not that the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, or charity, are in any way blinding. They experience blind faith as a modern term. They enlighten and heal and elevate reason, the light of reason. They enable, as they enabled Augustine, to live morally and intellectually. And so that's this kind of thing in terms of the intellectual. What happened then, at the beginning of the second millennium, you already have the development of the cathedral schools. You had Abelard, the Scientia Dialectica, and you had this burgeoning then of the universities, which is, as John Paul II and Benedict XVI have both said often, it emerged in Catholic Europe. The universities are not, it's a more or less Protestant secular conceit to think, it's a contradiction in terms to be Catholic and to be a university. They don't know their history. That these universities emerged from within the Catholic cultures, and this was within the cities, and they began to have this, where now the intellectual life procession would be carried out with a focus on scientia, science, and scholarship. And that became, and there was a concern, as any kind of development does. St. Bernard's, who's usually sort of portrayed rather shabbily because of his, but his worry about Abelard was primarily that, will this development, which is positive in itself, lead to a divorce between wisdom and holiness and science and scholarship? And if it does, we've already seen what it did in the Greek and Roman empires. It promotes a kind of death. And that was his concern. And the mendicant orders were founded, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, precisely to carry forward. Again, the later genuine developments don't negate the former. We still have monastic cathedral or seminaries and convent schools, as well as universities and colleges. And that was primarily this kind of, what it led to over from the 14th through the 16th century. Because of nominalism, there was a tendency to zero in on the particular. The nominalists wanted to study the particular, and they were somewhat concerned about this concern with the sapiential or wisdom or the whole, primarily because there's a series of difficult texts in reading Capriolus and Cajetan and others. You can see in terms of, over against, say, Occam, that there is this tendency, there's a loss of integration of the particular and the universal. Metaphysical wisdom tends to be more of a kind of, it surrenders much of its ontological link with judgment and truth and essay existence to logic. You see, the difference between grammar, logic, and metaphysics. Grammar dealing with external words, logic with our concepts and clarity in our concepts, metaphysics with what in fact is, what exists, ontology. So there was this loss of integration of the particular and the universal, and they wanted to study the particular. And this is, if you want a very difficult book, he taught in Münster when I was there, Hans Blumenberg, The Legitimacy of Modernity. The translator even admits into English he doesn't know that he's winging it in a lot of places. But this was, there was, I mean, one thing I had when in talking to Blumenberg, he has a long thing about how this invasion of the medievals against curiositas, or curiosity. And I went in to see him. I said, look, this is really a caricature. He says, what do you mean? And I said, curiositas was a vice. You know, it's kind of like the National Enquirer, inquiry minds want to know. It's gossip. It's what Heidegger called Gerede. They had a virtue, which is studiositas. So they're not against, you know, the kind of it he, and so he says, oh, well, that's the nice thing about German philosophers. You know, damn the particulars, full steam ahead. We got a conceptual Begrifflichkeit and so on. But anyway, that's Bultmann, too, with regard to John's Gospel, but that's a whole other thing. So you have that, and then, but what that enabled was this tremendous advance of the empirical sciences and scholarship, of the arts and technology, and it is phenomenal. I mean, look at, here we are, air-conditioned. If we were in Naples, Florida, boy, would really need air conditioning. Here you don't really experience it as so essential. But the lighting and all this and how we can come from all over the place, all of these tremendous advances. In fact, part of the difficulty was that the Enlightenment philosophers, you know, what they did was they threw out the baby and kept the bathwater. Namely, they saw, you know, and you have, we're going to see just briefly, Spinoza and others, they saw these European, the Protestants and the Catholics, religion was being abused by the politicians, especially promoting nation states. And if you want to have a major read on this with some things, but it's Jonathan Israel has a major book on the radical Enlightenment. And he shows, for instance, that it actually began about 100 years before it's usually been dated. But he shows how this built up. And Spinoza, he sees as so crucial in it. But you have this kind of, what happens is there's a certain derailment because in the wars of religion, or so-called wars of religion, they said, all right, we can no longer take any kind of revealed religion as publicly relevant. At best, it has to be the private individual decision. And instead, we will try to have reason, and reason alone, as the way of trying to integrate and work out. And so, but what they did was not reason in its classical mode, but reason, as Hobbes put it, following some of Spinoza, and actually also opposing some of Spinoza, because Spinoza is very in between on it. It's calculating reason. It's reason that's able to count. And so you have that calculating reason, and these derailments then of that there's no more sense of a whole, but rather only individual parts. And you have, I mean, I mentioned here, the loss of integration, the fragmentation, which is the key thing with regard to postmodernism. And so you have, like McIntyre has brilliantly showed in his book on Three Rival Traditions of Moral Inquiry, you've got all these sciences that they're doing all kinds of things. Well, how do we get this in any kind of order? Well, the alphabet. So we've got the encyclopedias. You know, and God is under G with gold and gorillas and other things. I mean, this is the kind of, you know, and it's a wonderful. I mean, the encyclopedias, I'm sure we've all used them, and they're fine, but they don't really satisfy the whole problem of integration. And so the other big thing is, well then, as he points out, the genealogists of power, following Nietzsche. And the way you can kind of describe it in a nutshell is, the genealogists come along and they say, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So much of the world is studying and reading English now. It's not because Shakespeare is more beautiful than any of the other great writers in the various languages, but it's because of the economic and political power of the English-speaking world and of America. And so we have the genealogists of power, and that is linked up with the fact that now order, see, if you haven't cultivated at least a metaphysical sapiential attunement to the whole, then what you see, any kind of order, is purely an act of will. There's a big difference. In fact, the Ave Maria School of Law, one of the key things, the difference in the understanding of law among the ancients and medievals versus the moderns. For the ancients and the medievals, law is an act of intelligence. The key thing about having good lawgivers is so that law will help to foster virtue. Because you need virtuous citizens. And if you don't have virtuous citizens, no matter how many police you have, you can put a policeman in every house, and it still isn't going to do the trick. And we found that out. We're finding it out. Now we've got more laws than anyone can shake a stick at. But do we have more order? I know some friends of mine who work in Watts, and they tell me about some of the things, or what we saw in terms of New Orleans and so on. This kind of, the sense of order and laws are acts of willpower rather than intelligence, and that kind of skews our understanding of law and of order, rather than attuning ourselves to what is the intrinsic order. Again, Flannery O'Connor, a procession rather than a march. And then there's this big dualism, as I've already mentioned, from Descartes and Kant on subject and object, on nature and reason, as though here's our reason and there's our nature. Or, it's sort of like, what was it I used to watch back when on the universe, and you'd have Carl Sagan looking out at the universe, you see. This was the Cartesian spectator looking out at the res extensa. So that kind of dualism, and this is why what we're facing with now at the beginning of the third millennium, that the key thing now has to be the integration of the sapiential and the scientific, the sapiential and the technological. This is one of the key things for Catholic graduate theological education. So it means, one of the great things here at Notre Dame, what John Cabadini has been able to bring about in terms of the study of early Christian writers. It's so important. I did a study in 1996 of all the dissertations done by members of the Catholic Theological Society of America. And at that time, 75% of those were done on 20th century thinkers, another 10% on 19th century. So you had 18 centuries with only 15%, and most of them were on the Bible. So what happened to the fathers? What happened to the medieval schoolmen? What happened to the Counter-Reformation? Things that are really crucial in terms of understanding this ongoing procession. So being a graduate theological student is really a challenge, and developing the kind of programs that are going to be able to address and have something to say to our culture, what the culture is ready to hear. Take, for instance, historicism, nihilism, relativism, this sort of dialectic of what we're facing. Very briefly, and I'll just end up on this. Spinoza, this is one of the key things in terms of the Bible. What? Oh, it's 2:30. Oh, yeah, but I still have to finish at 2:45, right? So, okay, guys, I'm sorry. My time, anyway, yes. Students say that's why I teach a course on eternity and time. I have this book coming out. Anyway, but you have Spinoza. He laid the philosophical foundations for historical criticism. Now, historical criticism, textual criticism, is marvelous. We know more about what Augustine calls the signa, the texts, the monuments, than any previous generation. I mean, all the manuscript variations, all of that, that's fine. It's not. The trouble with Spinoza and what the foundations are is when they say, Spinoza made two basic moves. First of all, forget about wisdom. Don't treat the Bible as a whole. We're going to treat the Bible, he says in his political theological treatise, treat the Bible the way we treat nature. There's no such thing as a whole. Break it up into parts. You just have individual sentences. So that's the first move, the analytic move. Then the second move is never raise the truth question. Of course, for him, he saw this, the truth question means power. So it's the meaning question. The meaning of one text, Spinoza says in his political theological treatise, is known by another text. So you have comparative textology. You have no theology. And what that does is really it contracts the exegete's consciousness and mind simply to the external signs, which he knows a lot about. But what do the signs signify? That is, Augustine's via inventionis and I remember some exegetes, making fun of what he says, the way of discovery in his De Doctrina Christiana. He says, that the signs signify realities. And it's these realities. The whole thing about the via inventionis is he wants us to cultivate the theological virtues so that we're attuned to the realities. That indeed, Jesus Christ is the Word incarnate and so on. So he wants these realities. The way, Kierkegaard, for instance, responded to Spinoza's thing by telling the story of this famous German exegete. He made him up, but who had published volumes and volumes on the New Testament, was the authority. And he was heard mumbling on his deathbed, but is he really the Son of God? That's the truth question. See, this is where it's so crucial for theologians that we have to, both take into account the historical critical methods and all they've done, but historicism, see, what historicism does is it truncates our quest. It leaves it all on, if you will, a horizontal level, as though, well, here we've got Paul, and here's Jesus Christ, and here we are down here after so many millennia. And as though it's just a question of seeing how one text relating to another text. What they don't realize is that Jesus Christ is the Word, and that Paul and all of these texts are referring to trans-temporal realities that don't negate time. They take every instant of time up themselves, and that's what I'm trying to show in this book. I published a few things on it, where Augustine, Boethius, Aquinas have an understanding of eternity, time. Eternity is God. Time is the universe, the whole created universe. And the notion of time as presence rather than time as only the measure of motion. I mean, the example I give is, look, you've had to listen to me for almost an hour now, or for 50 minutes almost. And it can be, oh gosh, when is it ever going to end? It just stretches out when you're bored or something. And yet, if you're involved in something very exciting, reading a novel or seeing a great play or whatever, having a good conversation with someone you love, time just flies by. That's time is presence, presence seen. And Augustine says of God, God is totum esse praesens, the whole of everything existing presencing, as only God can. So that is, historicism doesn't do justice to history, because history isn't merely the measure of motion. History is each and every human being in this great procession, going out from God and returning to God. Then in terms of nihilism, this contraction of consciousness to the monadic me. And if you really want to see a contrast, read Augustine's Confessions and then read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions. He did it explicitly in contradiction to Augustine. Augustine, what constitutes reality? It's the interpersonal conversation between Augustine and God. And why doesn't he name all the people in the first 4 books, his descent into disordered living? Because he knew he was loving them in a disordered way, not for who they are, but for how they satisfied his itch, as he called it. This was his common law wife and other, and his friend who died, in book 4 and so on. So he recognized that, and the whole issue is the reality is constituted by interpersonal conversation. That's what makes things real. And that genre, Augustine said it for 1.5 millennium. You see it in St. Teresa of Avila's life. You see it in a very interesting way in Ignatius of Loyola's life, that it's narrated in the third person because he narrated it to a person. But this is, when you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, very little of God. God is there as a kind of judge every once in a while, and God says, and towards the end, Rousseau says, if anybody disagrees with my presentation of myself, it's egophanic, as Vogelin says, God is my judge, and let them be stifled. But what gives reality to the modern autobiography? Rousseau said the whole genre, the modern, it's dates and places. Every page almost you see a date or a place, and that gives a sense of reality. It's this contraction to the empirical. There is a way that the first millennia, this sapiential scientia, is really promoting what Augustine and Aquinas will call the ratio superior, whereas the second millennium really has fostered the ratio inferior. Now, what they're getting at there is not, as Aquinas says, they're not 2 different reasons. It's reason as it attends to itself and to what it transcends its reason, namely the reality of the angels and God. And then ratio inferior is when we're most of the time we're concerned about, our daily life, everything outside, our senses, our imaginations, our appetites, and so on. And so and both of them are very important. And so we have a terrific task in the third millennium, and this is the great joy and challenge, is precisely to overcome the negative aspects through the joy in the truth. Because it's the joy of a holiness and wisdom integrating the sciences, scholarships, technologies, avoiding the dehumanization of man, which is the big danger in biotechnology. And that's why in terms of relativism, the eclipse of judgment and wisdom, informing the will, Aquinas versus Kant. I highly recommend Giovanni Sala's work on, the only English is a collection of his writes, the University of Toronto Press, on Bernard Lonergan and Immanuel Kant. But he uses a lot of Aquinas, and in fact, as Father Henley, the Jesuit philosopher, in his writings indicated, Lonergan is not a transcendental Thomist. And there's various reasons for that. He really is, his sources are Aquinas. And his big thing was precisely what Aquinas grasped, that we grasp the universal in the particular, when he called it insight. The agent intellect, grasping the universal in the particular, in the phantasm. There's not this opposition between the universal and the particular. They're one. This is the sapiential approach. Kant, it's just, it's all will. Goodness is only known by will, the categorical imperative. And then Christopher Dawson, this is a big thing. And why graduate theological students were John Paul II and now Benedict XVI have said, we really have to be part, it's crucial for the new evangelization. And in many respects, the new evangelization is much more demanding and harder than the evangelization of the Greek and Latin fathers. Why? Because they could appeal to philosophers who had a notion of the sapiential, of living by what is highest in us, of us as being an integral unity, identity, whole, embodied, and taking up into ourselves, as a microcosm, the whole macrocosm. Today, as John Paul II put it, we have to teach about nature. We cannot appeal because of this derailments that occurred. And I often think, if the Enlightenment philosophers had not been able to hitch their rather shop-worn wagons to empirical sciences and technology, they never would have been as influential as they were. And so that's why then this aspect of Dawson, he says the new Leviathan in many respects is worse than the old paganism. We've got an enormous task, and but there is this joy in the truth. I should get back to something on the title. The procession of the intellectual apostolate for 2 millennia, and now, we're at the dawn of the 3rd millennia. It's within the divine processions and missions of the Word and the Spirit. And this is why it's the real joy that, because the truth is the fruit of wisdom, not of power. It's not something that is imposed upon us. It's something that our deepest natures long for and we want. And I'm sure you've all had that experience of how when people who are really living the gospel and intellectuals who are really appreciating the beauty and richness of our tradition and the wonderful things that can be done in that, they communicate a joy that's infectious. And it really is so that this procession, even though we meander and it's not as regulated, and maybe deans are kind of upset that it's not quite as regulated and machine-like as it could be, but it is a procession, as Flannery O'Connor said, which is really going somewhere. It's going into an eternal kingdom, and so that our friendship is not just with those with whom we are living now, but cultivating in graduate theology friendship with the great theologians of the past, and knowing that they are alive and well in Christ Jesus. And please God, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, theology is only a subaltern science. We're only subaltern. That is, the principles of our scientia are the knowledge God has of himself and the knowledge of the blessed. So I often tell my PhD students, one of whom will be defending next week, well, you now have a union card. You can start going to work in the procession. But you're really not going to be a theologian and know the principles until we enter by God's grace, and only by his grace, into the beatific vision. But I've really kept you too long, and now we've got a few minutes. I have a 4 o'clock flight. 4 o'clock, yes. But if you have any questions or comments, anything, yes?
You mentioned the Enlightenment supporting the sciences for their own use. It strikes me that the sciences seem in a way to be rather, physical sciences are a holdover of first millennium approach to wisdom and insight. Do you think we're going to be seeing a lot more default collaboration with them because we're living in the same world that they are?
That's very good. I had the pleasure of knowing Werner Heisenberg, the father of quantum mechanics. One of his daughters married a grandson of Thomas Mann, the novelist, and they were studying there in Münster when I was there. Heisenberg's father was a classics professor. Heisenberg said he used to read the dialogues of Plato. Just precisely this point that, in fact, the difference between the intelligible and the sensible. And remember, in the cave, in Book 7 of the Republic, the shadows on the wall are not illusions. That was 18th century Cambridge Neoplatonism. They're realities. But the intelligible, when the slave is able to turn around, the intelligible is the cause of the sensible. And he says, this is the irony that often modern science was taken as a rejection of the first millennium or of the ancients, and in fact it isn't. It's a further development, and he said he couldn't. So I think that is, and I think especially now, we just had Augustine Peter Lawler at Ave Maria on Wednesday, and this work of being able, the scientists worried about some of the tendency to want to too quickly convert their theoretical explorations to technological productive uses, and that's so. There's a real, I think, over the next 2 or 3 generations. And remember, I mean, one of the things I had a very wise and holy monk come and address some faculty at Boston College, and he said, it took the Enlightenment about 3 centuries to get us off track. So we're going to get back on and to have this integration, it's going to take 2 or 3 centuries. So we don't have a day to lose. But I think you're right. I think there is going to be more of that.
Thinking about the beginnings of the university in the Middle Ages is how much they relied on the power of the papacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that we have this first millennium intellectual orientation, which is sapiential, scientia, and we have this, we have the papacy working with the bishops. We have this meeting. And then in the second millennium, we have this, we begin to see the split between the papacy and the bishops of the East. I'm just wondering about these connections between ecclesiology and the renewal of the university as part of it.
Yeah, no, that's very important. In fact, the papacy became increasingly important in the second millennium. Although it's there in the first millennium as well. And there isn't this there is a way that the importance of the papacy precisely in the context of the particular mediating the universal. And it's central. And that's why part of the ecclesiological task of the third millennium, as John Paul II, is precisely the reunification with the East. And it's going to be, most of the really profound theological issues have been pretty well worked out, but there's a lot of ecclesial-political. I know some Orthodox theologian friends of mine who say if the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed in 1989, was it, we'd probably have reunification. But the collapse meant the freeing of the Eastern European countries, the Ukraine and others, where Stalin had been such a tyrant and expropriated the Catholic churches for the Orthodox. And so there's all these kind of tensions that have to be worked out. I would, by the way, highly, it's so important on this ecclesiological dimension. There's a book I'm reading, it just came out by Agostino Marchetto on the Second Vatican Council, and the subtitle is Counterpoints to its History, Contrapunto per la sua Storia. It will be out in English. What it is a collection of his reviews, and what it shows is precisely how we have not had an understanding of the Second Vatican Council from the context of resourcement, the whole 2 millennial tradition. That's why Benedict XVI, in his first statement after the Mass for the Cardinals, he said, I am committed, as John Paul II says, the Second Vatican Council is the compass for the third millennia. And the whole I am committed, as my predecessors were, to the full implementation of the Second Vatican Council in continuity with the 2 millennial tradition of the Church. What this book points out over and over again, we're missing a proper history. The history that's put out from the Bologna Institute run by Professor Alberigo. This is a long, detailed critique of that because what Father Dossetti, who founded the Institute, said, the event of the council was more important than the text. And we'll study the text, and what happens? Well, we study the text as though those theologians, or those texts where they're quoting the tradition, they become conservative. See, this is where conservative versus liberal came in, and it was devastating. I mean, it was the second session of the Vatican Council, and it really, graduate Catholic theology suffered enormously. There was all of a sudden this enormous drop. If you go to the Weiner Library, they have this catalog of all the dissertations done. You see this collapse of dissertations on the Fathers, on the medieval schoolmen, on the Counter-Reformation. That goes, everything, I once in frustration had to tell some students at BC, Jesus Christ was pre-Vatican II. He's also post-Vatican II and everything else. But, that became it was a Protestant discontinuity. And unfortunately, the Alberigo volumes follow in Comancheck, and in fact, I used to talk with Father Joseph about that. But it is, they tend to see that so that the ressourcement is neglected, and you see, oh, that's conservative, but then progressive. The key thing, the spirit of the council or the style of the council is really moving towards, and we're editing a book on the Second Vatican Council. In fact, I see Dr. Jackson here. She's contributing a very important article on Sacrosanctum Concilium, and the whole point is renewal within tradition. In fact, Cardinal Ruini was reviewing this book and saying how important it is, and he called in his review, he mentioned that Trent, the first history done of Trent was put on the Index of Forbidden Books. It was, again, this kind of, we lost on this point, but we gained on some of those, and so on. And he said we had to wait 300 years. Hopefully we won't have to wait 300 years for a good history of the Second Vatican Council to really see this millennial tradition, and that it is a compass to the third millennium, to what we... Next time you read through any document of Vatican II, look at the way wisdom, holiness, science, scholarship, technology, they come. There's a whole way of reading. The Holy Spirit was moving them, and they often say of the founders of the American Constitution, they wrote better than they knew. Well, it's certainly the case of any conciliar documents, that they are a compass, and this has been the key thing in terms of a lot of the work. So that's important, the ecclesiological dimension. Anyway, it's time. I have to run. Well, thank you. Yeah.